There is a name that disappeared from the map, not because the land it described was conquered, not because its people were destroyed, not because history erased it in the way history sometimes erases things, through fire, through flood, through the deliberate burning of libraries. This name disappeared through something quieter and stranger. It disappeared because it was never really the name at all. It was always someone else's word for a place that had its own name, a deeper name, an older name, one that had been spoken in that land for thousands of years before the outsiders arrived with their maps and their histories and their confident labels. You probably know the name Persia. You've seen it in textbooks, in museum placards, in the titles of history documentaries. The Persian Empire, the Persian Wars, Persian kings standing at the edge of the known world, demanding that Greece submit. It is one of the most resonant names in all of human history, carrying with it the weight of something vast and ancient and magnificent. And yet, if you open a modern atlas, Persia is nowhere to be found. In its place, there is Iran. Same mountains, same deserts, same plateau rising like a great stone table above the surrounding plains, same rivers threading down through ancient valleys, but a different name. A name that feels, to Western ears at least, entirely unrelated to the one that came before. So the question settles in the mind like dust after a long journey. What happened? When did Persia become Iran? And why does the answer, the real answer, feel like something that was quietly set aside, filed away in a drawer that most history books never quite get around to opening? If you think the answer is simply that the Iranian government made an official name change in 1935, you are technically correct. But you are also standing at the edge of a much deeper archive, looking down into layers of identity, an empire, a memory that stretch back not decades, but millennia. Because here is what that simple answer misses entirely. The people who lived in what we call Persia never called it Persia. That was always a foreign name, a Greek name, a name given by outsiders who looked at one corner of a vast civilization and assumed they were seeing the whole thing. The people themselves, for thousands of years, had another word for their homeland, a word that survived every empire, every invasion, every attempt to rewrite the story of who they were and where they came from. That word was Iran. And its survival across 3,000 years of history is one of the most quietly extraordinary stories the ancient world has to offer. Tonight, we are going to follow that name through time. We are going to walk back through the centuries, past the official decree of 1935, past the Islamic Revolution and the Safavid dynasty and the Mongol devastation, past the Arab conquest and the Greek occupation, all the way back to the very beginning, to the people who first settled the Great Plateau and gave it a name that would outlast everything that came after. And along the way, we are going to encounter something that the standard historical account tends to gloss over, something that sits at the edge of what we think we know about this land and its past. Because the plateau was not empty when history begins. It was not waiting for civilization to arrive. It was already ancient, already layered with the remains of peoples and cultures whose stories we are only beginning to recover. And some of what has been found there, buried beneath the sand and the centuries, does not fit neatly into the timeline we have been given, but we will get to that. First, let us settle into the geography. because you cannot understand the story of a place without understanding the land itself. If you are listening in the dark right now, let the room be quiet around you. Let the weight of the night settle. What we are about to explore has been waiting a very long time to be told properly. Before we go further, if you enjoy these kinds of journeys through history's deeper archives, the places where the official record thins out and something stranger and more interesting begins to show through, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you are listening somewhere in the dark right now, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. There is something quietly remarkable about the idea of people across the world, separated by oceans and time zones, all drifting towards sleep through the same ancient story. Now, the Plateau. Picture a vast, elevated table of land, roughly the size of Western Europe, lifted above the surrounding terrain, as if the earth itself decided to raise this particular region up toward the sky. The Iranian Plateau sits at an average elevation of over 1,000 meters above sea level, and in places it climbs much higher into ranges that catch the clouds and hold snow through the summer months. To the north, the Alborz Mountains run like a great wall along the Caspian coast, their southern slopes green and forested, their northern faces dropping sharply toward the sea. To the west, the Zagros Mountains form another barrier, a long spine of ridges and valleys running southwest toward the Persian Gulf, folded and refolded by tectonic forces over millions of years into a landscape of extraordinary complexity. To the east, the highlands gradually blend into the Hindu Kush and the ranges of Central Asia, creating a zone of transition that was never quite a border, never quite open, always something in between. And in the interior of this plateau, between these mountain walls, lies something that surprises people who have never thought carefully about the geography. Deserts, yes, salt flats that shimmer in the heat, so flat and so white that they look like frozen lakes. The Dasht-e-Kavir and the Dasht-e-Lut, two of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth, where summer temperatures can reach among the highest ever recorded on the planet's surface. But also, threading through and around these deserts, something else entirely. Fertile valleys where rivers run cold and clear from the mountains, highland meadows where grass grows thick enough to support great herds, and beneath the desert surface, a system of underground water channels called qanats, some of them ancient beyond reckoning, carrying snowmelt from the mountain roots down through the rock and the gravel to emerge as springs in places that would otherwise be uninhabitable. The people who built those qanats were not primitive. They were engineers. They understood hydrology and geology and the patient mathematics of water moving slowly through stone. Some of the qanat systems still in use in Iran today were constructed over 2,000 years ago. They represent a kind of knowledge that was earned through generations of careful observation, through failure and adjustment, and the accumulated wisdom of people who had no choice but to understand their landscape deeply if they wanted to survive in it. This is the first thing to understand about the Iranian Plateau. It is not a place that forgives carelessness. It demands adaptation, ingenuity, a willingness to work with the land's peculiarities rather than against them. And the people who have lived here across the millennia have been shaped by that demand in ways that go very deep into their architecture, their poetry, their philosophy, their sense of identity. The plateau did not produce one culture, it produced many, woven together across the centuries through trade and intermarriage and the slow drift of languages and ideas, coastal communities living differently than mountain dwellers, desert peoples developing entirely different skills than valley farmers, highland pastoralists moving their herds through seasonal cycles that had been established for thousands of years before anyone wrote them down. The Iranian plateau is not a backdrop for history. It is a participant in it, shaping the people who live within its walls as surely as any king or conqueror. And people had been living here for a very long time. This is where the story begins to get interesting, and where we start to encounter the parts that the standard account tends to skip past rather quickly. The archaeological record of the Iranian plateau extends back far beyond the famous empires, far beyond the Persians and the Medes, far beyond even the Elamites of the southwest, who built one of the world's first urban civilizations. The plateau has been inhabited continuously for tens of thousands of years, and the evidence of its earlier inhabitants is still being uncovered, still being analysed, still yielding surprises that complicate the tidy narrative we have been given about when civilization began and where. In the southwest, near modern Khuzestan province, the Elamites built something remarkable. Their capital at Susa was already ancient when the first Persian kings were still tribal chieftains in the highland valleys. Susa had been occupied since at least 4000 BCE, possibly earlier. It had writing, monumental architecture, complex administrative systems, trade networks that reached into Mesopotamia and beyond. The Elamites were not Persians. They were not even speaking an Iranian language. They were their own distinct people with their own culture, their own gods, their own way of organizing the world. And they would remain a major power in the region for over 2,000 years, outlasting empires that rose and fell around them, absorbing influences from Mesopotamia and the plateau alike, maintaining an identity that was neither one nor the other, but something entirely their own. Further south, in what is now Kerman province, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of another culture, one that most people have never heard of. The Jiroft civilization, as it has come to be called, dated to around 2500 BCE, produced artifacts of extraordinary sophistication. Carved chlorite vessels decorated with mythological scenes, evidence of metalworking at a level that implies generations of accumulated craft knowledge, indicators of a society wealthy enough to support specialist artisans, which means a society organized enough to produce agricultural surpluses large enough to free some people from food production entirely. That is not a simple thing. That requires administration, storage, distribution, the whole complex machinery of what we call civilization. We do not know what the Jiroft people called themselves. Their writing system, if they had one, has not been deciphered. Their relationship to the later Iranian cultures that would rise around them remains unclear. They are a presence in the archaeological record, a set of beautiful and mysterious objects, a suggestion of something significant that we have not yet fully understood. And then there are the sites that do not fit easily into any established chronology at all. Consider what has been found at Shari Sokhta, the burnt city, in the Sistan region of eastern Iran. This site dates to around 3200 BCE and represents one of the earliest large urban settlements in the world. It had a population that may have reached as high as 20,000 people at its peak. It had specialized craft quarters, a complex mortuary district, evidence of surgery, evidence of board games, evidence of a prosthetic eye fitted to a burial. 20,000 people living in an organized urban environment 5,000 years ago, in a region that most people would not think of as a cradle of civilization. The burnt city burned and was abandoned around 1800 BCE for reasons that are still debated. Climate change is one possibility, the drying of the rivers that fed its irrigation systems. Conflict is another. The archaeology shows evidence of destruction. But what is most striking about the site is not how it ended, but how it began, how it flourished, how it represents a level of social complexity that pushes back our understanding of when organized urban life appeared on the Iranian plateau. And Shari Sokhter is not alone. Across the plateau, archaeologists have been finding evidence of sophisticated prehistoric settlements, some of them predating the famous civilizations by centuries or even millennia. Tepe Sialk near Kashan, with its painted pottery and its evidence of early metalworking dating back to around 5500 BCE. Tep Hissa in the northeast, with its remarkable Bronze Age remains. Torli Bakan in Fars province, near where the Persian Empire would later rise, with its extraordinarily fine painted ceramics from around 4500 BCE. The picture that emerges from all of this is not the one we were taught. The Iranian plateau was not a peripheral zone waiting to be civilized by the great empires of Mesopotamia. It was a center in its own right, with its own traditions of urban organization, craft production, artistic expression, and social complexity that stretched back into the deep past. The empires we know about, the Elamites, the Medes, the Persians, the Parthians, the Sassanids, were not the beginning of civilization on this plateau. They were the most recent chapters in a very long book. And here is where we need to pause for a moment, because this is where the story of names becomes entangled with something deeper. When the Iranian-speaking peoples began migrating onto the plateau from the north and northeast, sometime in the second millennium BCE, they were not arriving in an empty land. They were entering a landscape already dense with history, already marked by the remains of earlier cultures, already shaped by thousands of years of human habitation. The people they encountered, the Elamites, the inhabitants of the burnt city and its neighbors, the descendants of the Jiroft civilization, these were not savages waiting to be taught how to live. They were the inheritors of ancient traditions that the newcomers would absorb, adapt, and build upon. The Iranian-speaking migrants were part of the broader Indo-European family, peoples speaking languages that were ancestrally related to what would eventually become Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and the modern languages of Europe. They moved onto the plateau gradually, over centuries, in small groups of pastoralists following their herds through the highland valleys. They did not arrive as a conquering army. They arrived as neighbors, as trading partners, as people who intermarried with the existing populations and slowly, generation by generation, made the plateau their own. These Iranian-speaking peoples would eventually differentiate into distinct groups. The Medes in the northwest, controlling the great highland valleys and the trade routes to Mesopotamia. The Persians in the southwest, in the region the Greeks would call Persis. The Parthians in the northeast, in the steppe country near the Caspian, the Sogdians and the Bactrians further east. Many others whose names have been preserved only partially, or not at all. But they shared something crucial: a common linguistic heritage, a common set of cultural practices, a common religious tradition that would eventually develop into Zoroastrianism, and a common name for the land they were claiming as home. That name was Aryanam, land of the Aryans. In Old Persian, the language of the Achaemenid inscriptions, it appeared as Aryana. In Middle Persian, the language of the Sassanid Empire, it became Eren. Eventually, Iran. The word Aryan, in this original context, had nothing to do with the racial ideology that would later misappropriate it with such catastrophic consequences. It was simply what these Iranian-speaking peoples called themselves. The word meant something like noble or free, and it functioned as a marker of linguistic and cultural identity, distinguishing this group of peoples from their neighbours who spoke different languages and organised their societies according to different principles. It was an insider term, a word for the community itself, for the shared heritage that connected the Medes and the Persians and the Parthians and all the other Iranian peoples to one another, despite their political differences. And this is the crucial thing to hold in mind as we move forward through the centuries. From the very beginning, the people of the Plateau had their own name for their homeland. They called it Iran, or variations of that word, in their inscriptions and their poetry and their royal proclamations. This was not a name imposed from outside. This was the name they chose for themselves, the name that carried their identity, the name that told them who they were and where they belonged. The name Persia came from somewhere else entirely. The Greeks, who would eventually write the histories that shaped Western memory of the ancient Near East, encountered the Iranian world primarily through one group, the Persians of Fars province, who under the Achaemenid dynasty built the largest empire the world had yet seen. The Greeks called this province Persis, and they called its people Persians. And when the Achaemenid kings swept across the Near East, conquering Babylon and Egypt and Anatolia and pushing all the way to the borders of India, the Greeks called the whole thing the Persian Empire. It was not an unreasonable thing to do. The Persians were the rulers. The Persians were the ones the Greeks fought at Marathon and Thermopylae and Salamis. The Persians were the face of this vast Eastern power. So Persia it was, in the Greek texts, that would be copied and recopied across the centuries, that would form the foundation of Western historical knowledge about the ancient world. But the people inside the empire did not call it Persia. They called it Iran. Two names for one place, the insider name and the outsider name. And for the next 3,000 years, these two identities would coexist, compete, and tell very different stories about the same civilization. I am curious whether any of you have noticed this kind of pattern elsewhere. A civilization or a people known by one name to the outside world and something entirely different to themselves. If you have, leave it in the comments. The archive collects those kinds of connections. To understand how the Persians came to build their empire, we need to spend a little time with the people who came before them, the Medes. The Median story is frustrating in a particular way that historians learn to recognize as a sign that something important is being obscured by the limits of the surviving record. The Medes were a real and significant power. They destroyed the Assyrian Empire which was the dominant military force in the Near East for centuries. The empire that terrified its neighbours into compliance through campaigns of extraordinary brutality. The empire that deported entire populations and built its capital at Nineveh with the tribute extracted from a dozen conquered peoples. The Medes, in alliance with Babylon, brought all of that crashing down in 612 BCE. The fall of Nineveh was one of the great events of the ancient world, so momentous that the Hebrew prophets wrote about it with barely concealed satisfaction, so complete that within a generation the city had been reduced to rubble and sand. And yet, we know almost nothing about the Medes from their own perspective. They left almost no written records, no great libraries like the Assyrians, no monumental inscriptions proclaiming their achievements in their own words. Almost everything we know about them comes from outside sources. Herodotus, writing a century and a half after their empire had fallen, Assyrian records that mention them only as tribute-paying subjects or occasional threats. Later, Persian inscriptions that acknowledge the Medes as predecessors but do not elaborate on the details. The Greek historian Herodotus tells us that a man named Deioces convinced the Median tribes to unite under his leadership, that he built a magnificent capital at Ecbatana, the modern city of Hamadan, with 7 concentric walls, each painted a different colour, the innermost plated with silver and gold. It is a wonderful story. It has the quality of myth, of something that has been shaped by the telling and retelling across generations until it has acquired the smooth, luminous quality of legend. Modern archaeology has found evidence of significant settlement at Hamadan, but nothing quite like the spectacular 7-walled city Herodotus described. There are fortifications, administrative buildings, evidence of a substantial and important place, but whether it was really a capital in the sense we understand, a centralized administrative hub controlling a vast empire, or something more like the seat of a particularly successful tribal confederation, scholars are still genuinely uncertain. What we do know is that the Medes controlled the highland regions of western Iran for several generations, that they extracted tribute from smaller kingdoms and tribal groups across a wide area, and that one of those tribute-paying groups lived in the southwestern part of the Plateau in a region called Persia. The Greeks would later call it Persis. We know it as Fars province. The people who lived there called themselves Persians, and they were watching the Median kings very carefully. Empires built on tribal confederations are inherently unstable. They depend on the personal authority of successful military leaders, on the continued willingness of subordinate groups to accept their position, on the ability of the ruling group to keep winning and keep distributing the rewards of victory. When a strong king dies and a weaker one takes his place, the calculations change. Vassals begin to wonder whether their own ambitions might be achievable. They begin to notice the cracks in the structure that loyalty had previously obscured. Around 553 BCE, a Persian king named Cyrus decided he was done being anyone's vassal. He was the king of Anshan, a Persian territory in what is now Fars province, and he ruled as a vassal of the Median king Astyages. According to some traditions, Astyages was his grandfather. The arrangement should have been stable, but something changed. We do not know exactly what triggered the revolt. Herodotus gives us a story involving prophecies and dreams and an attempted infanticide, the kind of narrative that clusters around moments of historical rupture, shaping them into the patterns of destiny. What we know for certain is that Cyrus revolted, that he refused to send tribute, that he gathered support among other Persian tribes and discontented Median nobles, and that the army Astyages sent to crush the rebellion defected instead. By 550 BCE, Cyrus had captured Ecbatana. The Median Empire, such as it was, had become the Persian Empire. But here is the thing that gets lost in the standard telling of this story. Cyrus did not present himself as a conqueror replacing one civilization with another. He presented himself as a continuation. He adopted Median court practices. He retained Median nobles in positions of authority. He used the Elamite language for administrative purposes, as the Medes had done before him. He was, in his own framing, not destroying the inheritance of the Plateau, but inheriting it, taking up the mantle of those who had come before and carrying it forward. This pattern of continuity through apparent transformation would repeat itself throughout the history of the Plateau. Conquerors arrived, overthrew the existing power, and then found themselves absorbed into the deep culture of the place they had conquered. The land changed its rulers more reliably than its rulers changed the land. Cyrus went on to conquer Lydia in western Anatolia, then Babylon, then Egypt was added by his son Cambyses. His successor Darius extended the empire east into Central Asia and northwest into Thrace. By the time the Achaemenid Empire reached its greatest extent, it stretched from the Aegean coast to the Indus River, from the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Egypt. It was the largest empire the world had yet seen, encompassing dozens of different peoples, speaking dozens of different languages, organized under a single administrative system of remarkable sophistication. And the Achaemenid kings were very clear about what they called their realm. In the great inscriptions at Persepolis and Behistun and Naksh-i-Rostam, carved into the living rock of the Plateau in Old Persian and Elamite and Babylonian, Darius and his successors described themselves as kings of Iran, or more precisely, as kings of the Aryans, rulers of Arianam. The insider name, Ado, the ancient name, the name that connected them to the deep heritage of the Plateau and to the broader community of Iranian peoples who shared that heritage. The Greeks, watching from the west, called it the Persian Empire. The Achaemenid kings, writing for their own people, called it something else. This is not a trivial distinction. It tells us something important about how identity works, about the gap between how a civilization sees itself and how it is seen from outside. The name Persia was always a view from the outside, a label attached by people who encountered this civilization at its western edge and assumed they were seeing the whole. The name Iran was always a view from the inside, a self-description that carried within it the full complexity of what the Plateau's people understood themselves to be. When Alexander of Macedon swept through the Persian Empire in 334 to 323 BCE, burning Persepolis and scattering the Achaemenid court, it must have seemed to outside observers like the end of something. The empire that had dominated the Near East for 2 centuries had been conquered by a young Macedonian king who moved faster and hit harder than anyone had anticipated. The Persian court was destroyed. The Persian king fled and was murdered by his own nobles. The great palace complex at Persepolis, the symbolic heart of the empire, was put to the torch. And yet something survived. something that Alexander himself recognized and tried to incorporate into his own identity. Alexander did not simply destroy the Persian Empire. He tried to inherit it. He adopted Persian court dress. He required his Macedonian officers to perform the proskynesis, the Persian court prostration, a requirement that caused enormous resentment among men who considered themselves equals. He married Persian noblewomen and encouraged his officers to do the same. He retained Persian administrators in their positions. He was attempting in his own way to do what Cyrus had done 2 centuries earlier, to present himself not as a destroyer, but as a continuation. He failed in the sense that the Macedonian Greek cultural overlay he imposed never fully took root. The Seleucid dynasty that inherited his eastern territories after his death in 323 BCE maintained Greek as the language of administration and culture, founded Greek-style cities across the Plateau, and tried to graft Hellenic civilization onto the existing Iranian substrate. For a while, it seemed to work. Greek became the language of the educated elite. Greek artistic styles influenced local craft production. Greek philosophical ideas entered into dialogue with Iranian religious thought. But underneath all of this, the old identity persisted. The Iranian languages kept being spoken. The Zoroastrian religious tradition kept being practiced. The ancient name for the land kept being used. In private, in religious contexts, in the poetry and stories that circulated among people who were not part of the Greek-speaking administrative class. And then the Parthians arrived. The Parthians were an Iranian people from the northeast, from the steppe country near the Caspian Sea. They had been part of the Achaemenid Empire, then part of the Seleucid Empire, and around 247 BCE, they began asserting their independence under a dynasty called the Arsacids. Over the following century, they expanded steadily westward, taking advantage of Seleucid weakness to claim territory after territory, until, by the middle of the 2nd century BCE, they controlled most of the Iranian Plateau and much of Mesopotamia. The Parthian Empire is often described as a period of Iranian revival, a reassertion of the Plateau's identity after the Hellenistic interlude. This is broadly true, but it needs to be understood carefully. The Parthians were not simply replacing Greek culture with Iranian culture. They were doing something more complex, maintaining a bilingual, bicultural administration that used both Greek and Parthian, patronizing both Greek-style art and Iranian artistic traditions, presenting themselves to different audiences in different ways. What they did consistently was use that ancient name. The Arsacid kings called their realm Erenshah, the realm of Iran or Oareran. The insider name, the ancient name, the name that connected them to the long heritage of the Plateau. Whatever Greek cultural forms they maintained for diplomatic or administrative purposes, their identity was Iranian. And this pattern would continue through the next great dynasty, the Sassanids, who overthrew the Parthians in 224 CE and established an empire that would last for 4 centuries, until the Arab conquest of the 7th century. The Sassanid Empire is in many ways the most explicitly Iranian of all the pre-Islamic states. The Sassanid kings called themselves Shahanshah, King of Kings, a title with deep roots in the Iranian tradition. They promoted Zoroastrianism as the official state religion with an intensity that the Parthians had never attempted. They patronized a flowering of Iranian literature, art, and philosophy. They built on a massive scale, leaving behind palace complexes and rock reliefs and fire temples that still stand in the landscape of modern Iran as testimony to the ambition and confidence of that civilization. And they called their realm Iran, explicitly, consistently, in their inscriptions and their administrative documents and their religious texts. The name had survived the Achaemenids and the Greeks and the Parthians, and now it was being proclaimed with new pride and new clarity by a dynasty that understood itself as the inheritor of everything that had come before. The Sassanid king Ardashir, who founded the dynasty by overthrowing the last Parthian king in 224 CE, described himself in his inscriptions as King of Iran and non-Iran, a formulation that acknowledged the empire's multicultural reality while centering Iranian identity as the primary frame. His son Shapur V, who defeated 3 Roman emperors and carved his triumph into the living rock at Naqsh-e-Rostam, used the same formulation. These were not modest men. They were proclaiming their identity to history, and they were choosing the ancient name. But there is something else about the Sassanid period that deserves attention, something that connects to the deeper archaeological story of the Plateau. The Sassanid kings were intensely interested in the ancient past of their land. They patronized the collection and systematization of older texts and traditions. They promoted the idea that Iranian civilization was ancient beyond reckoning, that it stretched back to a mythological golden age described in the Avesta, the sacred text of Zoroastrianism, and elaborated in the great cycle of Iranian myth that would eventually be set down in Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, in the 10th century CE. In this mythological tradition, the Iranian plateau was not just the site of a few centuries of empire. It was the homeland of humanity itself, or at least of the noble and civilized portion of humanity. The mythological king Jamshid ruled a golden age in which disease and death and cold and hunger were unknown. The great hero Rostam performed deeds that echoed across the ages. The founding of civilization was not something that happened elsewhere and spread to Iran. It happened here, on this plateau, among these people. This is mythology, not history. But mythology is never simply false. It is a way of encoding deep cultural memory, of preserving the sense of a tradition's antiquity and significance in a form that can be transmitted across generations even when the specific historical details have been lost. The Sassanid kings who promoted these myths were drawing on something real, the genuine antiquity of the plateau's civilization, the genuine depth of the cultural heritage they were inheriting. And the archaeological record, as we are slowly learning to read it, suggests that the mythological sense of great antiquity was not entirely misplaced, because here is where the story takes a turn into territory that the standard historical account tends to handle with some discomfort. In the decades since systematic archaeological work began on the Iranian plateau in earnest, researchers have been uncovering evidence of human activity that pushes back the timeline of sophisticated occupation further and further. The sites we have already mentioned, Tepe Sialk, Tal-e-Bakan, Shari Sokta, represent a level of cultural complexity in the 5th and 4th millennia BCE that challenges the idea of a simple progression from primitive to civilized. But there are older sites still, and some of them raise questions that have not yet been fully answered. In the Zagros Mountains, cave sites have yielded evidence of human habitation stretching back tens of thousands of years. The Paleolithic hunters who sheltered in those caves were not building cities or writing inscriptions, but they were there, generation after generation, learning the landscape, developing the accumulated knowledge of where the game ran and where the water was and how to survive the long mountain winters. That knowledge was not lost when they died. It was transmitted, adapted, built upon over thousands of years until it became the foundation on which the later agricultural civilizations were constructed. The transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture on the Iranian Plateau happened early, perhaps as early as 9,000 to 8,000 BCE in some areas, making the Plateau one of the world's earliest centers of agricultural development. The wild ancestors of wheat and barley grew. In the Zagros highlands, the wild ancestors of domesticated goats and sheep grazed in the same region. The people who lived there were not simply lucky recipients of agricultural knowledge that developed elsewhere. They were among the inventors of it, among the people who first figured out that you could cultivate plants and manage animals rather than simply following them across the landscape. This is a profound thing. The Iranian Plateau was not a peripheral zone that received civilization from the great centers of Mesopotamia or Egypt. It was itself one of the places where the foundations of civilization were laid, where the experiments in agriculture and animal husbandry and settled community life that would eventually produce cities and writing and empires were first conducted. And yet this is rarely the frame through which the history of the plateau is presented. The standard narrative tends to begin with the Elamites or the Medes or the Persians, to treat the pre-literate history of the region as a kind of prologue to the real story. But the real story includes those 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge, those generations of people learning to read the landscape and work with it, those slow experiments in organization and cooperation that made the later civilizations possible. When the Iranian-speaking migrants arrived on the plateau in the second millennium BCE, they were not bringing civilization to an empty land. They were joining a conversation that had been going on for a very long time. And the name they brought with them, Aryanam, the land of the Aryans, was layered onto a landscape that already had names, already had memories, already had its own deep sense of what it was. The synthesis that resulted was not a simple replacement of one culture by another. It was a long, complex, layered process of mixing and adaptation, of new peoples absorbing old traditions and old peoples adopting new languages and new practices, until what emerged was something that was neither purely the migrant culture nor purely the indigenous culture, but a new thing, a distinctly Iranian thing, that carried within it the traces of everything that had contributed to its making. This is what the name Iran ultimately points to. Not a single people or a single moment of origin, but a long process of synthesis, a civilization built from many layers of human experience on a particular plateau, shaped by the specific demands of that landscape and the specific history of the peoples who had lived within it. Now let us return to the thread of history, to the moment when everything changed again. In 636 CE, an Arab army met a Sassanid force at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in what is now Iraq. The battle lasted several days. When it ended, the Sassanid army had been destroyed. The road to the heart of the Iranian plateau lay open. The Arab conquest of Iran, which unfolded over the following decade, was one of the most consequential events in the history of the region. The Sassanid Empire, already weakened by decades of war with Byzantium and by internal political instability, collapsed with a speed that shocked both the conquerors and the conquered. The last Sassanid king, Yazdegerd III, fled eastward across his own empire, seeking support that never materialized, and was murdered by a miller near Merv in 651 CE. The dynasty was extinguished. The Zoroastrian state religion was displaced by Islam. The Arabic script began replacing the Pahlavi script for writing Persian. To outside observers, this might have looked like the end of Iranian civilization. The name Persia, already largely a Greek and Roman convention by this point, faded further from use. The new rulers called the region by its Arabic name, Al-Ajam, the non-Arabs, or by the names of its provinces. The old Sassanid administrative system was dismantled and replaced by the caliphate structure. And yet, within 2 centuries of the Arab conquest, something remarkable was happening. The Iranian peoples who had converted to Islam were not simply becoming Arabs. They were becoming Muslim Iranians, bringing their own cultural heritage into the new religious framework, finding ways to maintain their identity within a civilization that was formally committed to the equality of all believers, regardless of ethnic origin. The Iranian bureaucratic class, the scribes and administrators who had served the Sassanid state, found that their skills were indispensable to the new Abbasid Caliphate. The Caliphate needed people who knew how to run a complex empire, who understood irrigation systems and tax collection and the management of distant provinces. The Iranians knew how to do these things. They had been doing them for centuries. And so they entered the Abbasid administration in large numbers, bringing with them not just their administrative skills, but their cultural values, their literary traditions, their sense of what a civilized court should look like. The Abbasid Caliphate, that reached its peak under Harun al-Rashid and al-Mamun in the 8th and 9th centuries, was in many ways as much an Iranian as an Arab creation. The court at Baghdad, founded in 762 CE, was modelled partly on Sassanid court practices. Iranian literary forms influenced Arabic poetry. Iranian philosophical traditions entered into dialogue with Greek philosophy to produce the great intellectual synthesis of the Islamic Golden Age. The Barmakid family, Iranian viziers who served the early Abbasid caliphs, were among the most powerful figures in the Islamic world. And through all of this, the Persian language survived. More than survived. It was reborn. New Persian, written in Arabic script, but structurally and lexically continuous with Middle Persian, emerged in the 9th and 10th centuries as one of the great literary languages of the medieval world. The poets who wrote in New Persian were not simply imitating Arabic models. They were drawing on a tradition of Iranian poetry and storytelling that stretched back centuries, finding new forms for ancient sensibilities, creating a literature of extraordinary richness and depth. Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, completed around 1010 CE, is the supreme example of this revival. The Book of Kings is an epic poem of 60,000 couplets telling the history of Iran from the mythological creation of the world to the Arab conquest. It is a work of conscious cultural preservation, written at a time when the Iranian identity was under pressure from Arabization, deliberately designed to keep alive the memory of what Iran had been and what it could be again. Ferdowsi famously wrote that through his poem he had raised a great structure of words that no rain or wind would ever bring down, that he had given new life to the ancient name, and the ancient name he used consistently and deliberately throughout the poem was Iran, not Persia, not the Greek name, not the outsider's label. The insider name, the name that had been carried through the Arab conquest and the Abbasid Caliphate and the slow transformation of the culture, the name that connected the present to the mythological golden age of Jamshid and the historical glory of the Achaemenid and Sassanid empires. The name had survived. Again, what is it about this particular story that keeps you awake, I wonder? Is it the idea that a name can carry an entire civilization inside it, that a word spoken quietly in a poem can outlast an empire? If something in this history connects to a mystery that has been turning in your own mind, I would genuinely like to hear it in the comments. Over the following centuries, a series of Iranian dynasties rose and fell across the plateau. The Samanids in the northeast, who patronized the early flowering of new Persian literature. The Buyids, who controlled Baghdad itself and reduced the Abbasid caliphs to figureheads while maintaining the fiction of their religious authority. The Ghaznavids, who built a great empire stretching into Central Asia and India. Each of these dynasties presented itself as the inheritor of the Iranian tradition, used the Persian language as the primary language of culture and administration, and understood itself as part of the long continuum of Iranian civilization. Then came the Mongols. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century were catastrophic for the Iranian plateau in a way that is difficult to overstate. Genghis Khan's campaigns and those of his successors destroyed cities that had stood for centuries, killed populations that had maintained agricultural systems for generations, broke irrigation networks that had been built and maintained over thousands of years. The city of Nishapur, one of the great centers of Persian culture and learning, was reportedly reduced to rubble and its entire population killed. The city of Merv, another major center, suffered a similar fate. The Mongol general Hulagu's sack of Baghdad in 1258, which ended the Abbasid Caliphate and killed the last caliph, was one of the defining catastrophes of the medieval Islamic world. And yet, as with every previous catastrophe, the Iranian identity survived. The Mongol Ilkhanate, which ruled the Iranian plateau from 1256 to 1335, followed the now familiar pattern. The conquerors arrived, overthrew the existing power, and then found themselves absorbed into the culture they had conquered. Within 2 generations of the conquest, the Ilkhan rulers had converted to Islam. Within 3, they were patronizing Persian literature and art and presenting themselves as heirs to the Iranian tradition. The Persian language remained the language of culture and administration. The ancient name persisted in use. The Timurid dynasty that followed, founded by Timur, another Central Asian conqueror of Turkic and possibly Mongol heritage, repeated the pattern with remarkable consistency. Timur himself was capable of extraordinary violence, destroying cities and building towers of skulls with the same energy he brought to military campaigns. But his successors at Herat created one of the most brilliant courts in the medieval Islamic world, a center of Persian poetry and painting and philosophy that drew scholars and artists from across the region. The Safavid dynasty, which reunified the Iranian plateau under a single rule in 1501, represents in some ways the culmination of this long process of cultural continuity. The Safavids were Azerbaijani Turks in terms of their ethnic origin, but they ruled in Persian, promoted Persian culture, and made Twelver Shia Islam the state religion of their realm in a way that further distinguished Iranian identity from the Sunni Ottoman Empire to the west. They called their realm Iran. They used the ancient name with the same deliberateness that the Sassanids had used it 1,000 years before, and it was under the Safavids that the European world began to take sustained notice of Iran in a new way through the diplomatic and commercial contacts that multiplied in the 16th and 17th centuries. European travelers and diplomats visited the Safavid court at Isfahan. They wrote accounts of what they saw. They reported on a civilization of considerable sophistication and beauty, a court that rivaled anything in Europe in its patronage of arts and architecture, a city whose great central square, the Naksh-e-Jahan, was one of the largest and most beautiful public spaces in the world. And in their accounts, these European visitors used the name Persia, because that was the name in their classical sources, the name inherited from the Greeks, the outsider name that had been attached to this land for 2,000 years in the Western tradition. The insider name, Iran, was known to them only as a local usage, something the Persians themselves used, slightly exotic, slightly unfamiliar. This gap between the insider name and the outsider name persisted through the Qajar dynasty, which replaced the Safavids in 1706 and ruled until 1925. The Qajars called their realm Iran in Persian, but the Western world continued to call it Persia in English and French and German and the other European languages. Two names, two perspectives, two ways of understanding the same place, persisting side by side across the centuries. Then came 1935. The Pahlavi dynasty, which had replaced the Qajars in 1925 under Reza Shah, made a formal request to the international community. Please call our country Iran, not Persia, Iran, the name we have always used for ourselves, the name that connects us to our ancient heritage, the name that is ours. This request has often been presented as a political act, a piece of nationalist ideology, an attempt by Reza Shah to emphasize the Aryan heritage of the Iranian people in a way that resonated with the fascist ideologies then gaining power in Europe. And there is some truth to this. The 1930s were a time of intense nationalist fervor across the world, and the Iranian government was indeed influenced by some of the ideas circulating in that political environment. But to reduce the name change to a political maneuver is to miss the deeper story entirely. The name Iran was not invented in 1935. It was not a nationalist fabrication or an ideological construct. It was the oldest name for the Plateau, the name that had been in continuous use among the people of that land for 3,000 years, the name that appeared in Achaemenid inscriptions and Sassanid rock reliefs and the poetry of Ferdowsi and the administrative documents of the Safavids. The 1935 request was not a renaming. It was a correction. It was the inside name finally, officially, replacing the outside name in the world's diplomatic vocabulary. The world complied. Persia became Iran on the maps and in the newspapers and in the official correspondence of foreign governments. A name that had been used by outsiders for 2,000 years was retired. A name that had been used by insiders for 3,000 years was finally given its proper place. And yet something was lost in the transition, or perhaps not lost, but obscured. Because the name Persia carried within it a particular set of associations, a particular vision of what this civilization had been and what it had achieved. The Persian Empire of Cyrus and Darius, the Persian Wars, the Persian court that Alexander tried to inherit. These were the images that the word Persia conjured in the Western imagination. Images of a civilization that was ancient and magnificent and somehow complete, a chapter of history that had ended. The name Iran suggested something different, something living, something continuous, something that had not ended but had persisted, adapting and transforming through every catastrophe that history could devise, carrying within it the accumulated memory of everything that had come before. Which brings us back to the deeper question, the one that has been waiting beneath the surface of this entire story. What does it mean that a civilization can maintain its identity across 3,000 years of invasion, conquest, and transformation? What is being preserved when a name survives through the fall of empires and the replacement of religions and the wholesale destruction of cities and libraries? What is the thing that persists? Part of the answer is language. The Persian language, in its various forms, has been spoken on the Iranian plateau for over 3,000 years. Old Persian gave way to Middle Persian, gave way to New Persian, but the thread of continuity is unbroken. A speaker of modern Persian can read Ferdowsi's Shahnameh with relative ease. A scholar of modern Persian can access the Sassanid inscriptions with some effort. The language is not merely a tool for communication, it is a vessel for memory, carrying within its vocabulary and grammar and poetic forms the accumulated experience of the people who have spoken it across the centuries. Part of the answer is geography. The plateau itself is a kind of container, a bounded space defined by its mountain walls that has shaped the people within it in consistent ways across the generations. The challenges of the landscape, the need for sophisticated water management, the particular rhythms of the highland climate, the specific resources available, and the specific constraints imposed. These have been constants across the centuries, shaping the culture in ways that persist even when everything else changes. Part of the answer is the great literary tradition, the Shahnameh, and the poetry of Hafiz Omr, Bas and Rumi and Sadi, and the 100 other poets who constitute the Persian literary canon. These texts have been memorized and recited and passed from generation to generation, carrying within them not just stories, but values, ways of understanding the world, images of what it means to be Iranian. When Ferdowsi wrote his 60,000 couplets in the 10th century, he was not just telling stories. He was building a cultural archive, a repository of identity that could survive the political catastrophes that were already visible on the horizon. And part of the answer is something harder to name, something that has to do with the deep continuity of a civilization that has been living in the same landscape for so long that the landscape itself has become part of the identity. The mountains and the deserts and the ancient irrigation systems and the ruins of previous civilizations that dot the plateau are not just scenery. They are memory. They are the physical record of everything that came before, available to anyone who knows how to read them. When you stand at Persepolis, the great palace complex that the Achaemenid kings built in the 5th century BCE and Alexander burned in the 4th, you are standing in a place that has been understood as a sacred site of Iranian identity for over 2,000 years. The Sassanid kings carved their own inscriptions nearby, claiming the Achaemenid legacy. Medieval Iranian poets wrote about the ruins as evidence of the transience of earthly power and the persistence of Iranian memory. Modern Iranians visit the site as a pilgrimage, a connection to a past that is still felt as present. The ruins are not just the remains of a destroyed empire. They are a message transmitted across the centuries, from the people who built them to the people who come after. We were here. We built this. We called this land by its ancient name, and we believed that name would outlast us. They were right. There is one more layer to this story, one more thread that runs beneath the historical narrative and connects to the deepest questions about the plateau and its past. We spoke earlier about the archaeological evidence of sophisticated civilization on the Iranian plateau, stretching back far beyond the famous empires. The Qanat builders, the Jiroft craftsmen, the inhabitants of the burnt city, the agricultural pioneers of the Zagros highlands. These people were the deep foundation on which everything else was built. Their knowledge, accumulated over thousands of years of careful observation and patient experiment, was the substrate from which the later civilizations grew. But there are sites on and around the Iranian plateau that have not yet yielded their full secrets. Sites that have been excavated only partially, or not at all, because the resources and the political conditions and the scholarly consensus have not yet aligned to make full investigation possible. Sites that have produced artifacts or architectural remains that do not fit neatly into the established chronology, that seem to imply a level of organization or sophistication earlier than the current models predict. The site of Jiroft, for example, which we mentioned earlier, was only systematically excavated beginning in the early 2000s, after looting had already destroyed much of the stratigraphy that would have allowed precise dating. What the excavations revealed was extraordinary, but the full extent of the site and the full range of its cultural connections remain unclear. There are researchers who believe that Jiroft may have been the center of a trading network that connected the Iranian plateau to the Indus Valley civilization and to the Gulf Coast, a network of exchange that was operating at a high level of sophistication in the 3rd millennium BCE, and that has been largely invisible in the historical record because its center was in a region that received less archaeological attention than Mesopotamia or Egypt. Similarly, the site of Tepe Sialk, near the modern city of Kashan, has been excavated in stages over the past century, and each excavation has pushed back the timeline of sophisticated occupation at the site. The earliest levels date to around 5500 BCE, but the site continued to be occupied through the Bronze Age, and the later levels show evidence of connections to cultures across the plateau and beyond. The full picture of what Tepe Sialk represents, what role it played in the networks of exchange and influence that connected the ancient Near East is still being assembled. And then there is the question of the deep past, the Paleolithic and Mesolithic occupation of the Plateau, the people who were there before agriculture, before cities, before the written record. The cave sites of the Zagros have been excavated in places, and they have yielded evidence of long occupation, of people living in those caves through the last ice age and into the early Holocene, developing the knowledge of the local environment that would eventually make agriculture possible. But the full extent of this occupation, the full range of what those people knew and how they organized their lives, remains largely unknown. What all of this suggests is that the history of the Iranian plateau is deeper and more complex than the standard account acknowledges. The civilizations we know about, the ones that left written records and monumental architecture and artifacts that ended up in museums, were not the beginning. They were the most recent chapters in a story that had been unfolding for tens of thousands of years, on a landscape that had been shaped by human activity for longer than most of us are accustomed to thinking about. The name Iran carries all of that history within it, whether or not the people who use it are consciously aware of the depth they are invoking. When Ferdowsi wrote about the ancient glory of Iran, he was reaching back to the mythological golden age of Jamshid, but he was also, in some sense, reaching back toward the real deep past of the plateau, the accumulated memory of a civilization that had been building itself for a very long time before the empires that history remembers. And when the Iranian government made its request in 1935, asking the world to use the ancient name, they were doing something that was both politically motivated and genuinely historically appropriate. They were insisting that the world used the name that the people of the plateau had always used for themselves, the name that connected the present to the deep past, the name that had survived everything that history could throw at it. There is something in this story that speaks to a larger truth about how civilizations work, about what it is that persists through the catastrophes of history and what it is that gets lost. What gets lost usually is the surface, the specific political structures, the particular dynasties, the official languages of administration, the formal religious institutions. These things are vulnerable. They depend on continued power and continued resources, and when those fail, they fail quickly. The Achaemenid Empire fell in a decade. The Sassanid Empire collapsed in a generation. The Abbasid Caliphate was ended in a day. What persists is something deeper. The language that people speak at home, the stories they tell their children, the agricultural practices that have been refined over generations, the sense of connection to a particular landscape, the understanding of who one's people are and where they come from. These things are much harder to destroy. They can be suppressed, driven underground, forced to disguise themselves in the forms of the dominant culture. But they tend to survive. The name Iran survived because it was not just a political label. It was an identity, carried in the language and the literature and the landscape and the memory of the people who lived on the plateau. Every conqueror who tried to replace that identity found that they could control the surface, but not the depth. They could change the official name, the language of administration, the state religion, but they could not change what the people called themselves in their hearts. And so the name persisted through the Greeks and the Parthians and the Sassanids and the Arabs and the Mongols, and the Timurids, and the Safavids, and the Khazars, and the Pahlavis. Through every empire that rose and fell on the plateau, the name was there, waiting in the poetry, and the inscription, and the oral traditions, and the simple daily usage of ordinary people who had never stopped knowing where they lived. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson of this story. That identity is not something that is created by empires or governments or official decrees. It is something that grows slowly, over generations, from the interaction between a people and their landscape and their accumulated memory. It can be shaped and influenced by political events, but it cannot ultimately be replaced by them. It is too deep, too embedded in the daily texture of life, too thoroughly woven into the language and the stories and the ways of seeing the world that a people carries within itself. The Iranian Plateau is one of the oldest inhabited landscapes on Earth. The people who live there today are the inheritors of a cultural tradition that stretches back not just to the Achaemenid Empire or the Sassanid Empire, but to the farmers of the Zagros Highlands who first learned to cultivate wheat and barley 10,000 years ago, to the craftsmen of Jiroft who carved their intricate vessels 5,000 years ago, to the engineers who first dug the qanats that carried water through the desert to places where nothing should have been able to grow. All of that is in the name Iran, land of the Aryans, the ancient insider name that survived everything the outside world could impose upon it. When you hear that name now, perhaps you will hear it differently, not just as the name of a modern nation-state, not just as the replacement for a name that was always someone else's label, but as the echo of something very old. A name that has been spoken on that plateau for 3,000 years at least, and perhaps in the deep memory of the landscape itself for much longer than that. The mountains that ring the plateau have been there for millions of years. The deserts in the interior have been shifting and settling for thousands. The qanat systems carry water through the same underground paths they have followed for 2 millennia. And somewhere in the layered soil of the plateau, beneath the ruins of the empires and the settlements and the cities, beneath the evidence of all the civilizations that have risen and fallen on this land, there are older layers still, waiting to be found, waiting to tell us more about the deep past of this place and the people who have called it home. The archive is never fully closed. There are always more files, always more evidence, always more of the story waiting to be recovered by those patient enough to look. And the name endures. If this is the kind of night where sleep is slow in coming, let this video run again. The layers have a way of revealing themselves differently on a second listen. The names and the dynasties settling into a deeper pattern when the mind is quieter. And if someone you know carries a curiosity about the hidden depths of history, about the names and identities that official accounts tend to smooth over, consider passing this along to them. These older truths tend to find the people who are ready for them, and there is something quietly meaningful about two people, perhaps in different cities or different time zones, following the same thread through the dark. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whatever time it is in your corner or of the world, let that thought settle over you as you drift towards sleep. That somewhere beneath the noise of the present, beneath the official histories and the political narratives, and the names that outsiders give to places they only partly understand, there are older truths waiting quietly in the dark. Not threatening truths, not disturbing ones, just deep ones. The kind of truths that have been patient for a very long time and that have learned, through long experience, that patience is enough. The plateau is still there, the mountains still stand, the Kannats still carry their cold water through the rock. And in the poetry that has been recited on that land for 1,000 years, in the language that has been spoken there for 3,000, in the name that has endured through every empire and every catastrophe that history could devise, something persists that no conqueror has ever quite managed to extinguish. Iran, the land of the Aryans, the insider name, the ancient name, the name that was always there, waiting for the world to finally use it. Sleep well. The archive will be here when you return. The same question of what lies hidden beneath the official record runs through another story the archive has been keeping. The one about what may actually exist beneath the Sphinx at Giza, and why the answers have been so carefully controlled. That file is waiting for you whenever the night calls you back.